All right, so thanks everyone for listening in, and I'm going to be talking about the use of subseasonal forecasts to improve planetary health and human welfare. And I'd like to thank my advisor, Paul Block, who's been really instrumental in all of this research. So in 2017, Peru was hit by torrential downpours that were featured all over the news. The death toll kept climbing, as did the economic damage. And this wasn't the only time this had happened. It happened back in 1997 and 98 and 1982 to 83. And the root cause of these rains, an extreme El Nino, is only expected to become more frequent in the future due to climate change. On the other side of the world, Ethiopia is regularly subjected to drought, which can lead to food insecurity and even famine, like in the Great Famine of 1983 to 85. So kind of the first project that we're working on is in Peru, and that's looking at early humanitarian action for extreme rains. So in our Peru work, we've partnered with the Red Cross to optimize their early action plan for extreme rains. An improved ability to forecast extreme rains has prompted them to shift some of their resources from disaster response to disaster preparedness, which reduce costs while minimizing the risk of false alarms. And so they're targeting water, sanitation, and hygiene, emergency health, as well as direct cash transfers for the most vulnerable families. And it's based on a suite of forecasts, seasonal, a monthly, and a short-term forecast that kind of work together to hone in on a particular community that they want to use these early actions for. So our work has looked at the forecasts themselves, trying to improve them, or simply look at the trade-offs between a forecast trigger, which is how confident we are that an event is going to happen, and the ability to correctly predict extreme events without triggering a false alarm. So on the left, you can see one of our forecasts, which is an ensemble forecast. So the blue bars or blue boxes are sort of confidence bounds for what we think it would be, the precipitation would be, and then the black dots would be the actual observed precipitation. So as you can see, there's some work to be done, but we're generally at least catching the trends of where an extreme event, which we define as the 95th percentile, are happening. On the right, you can see a sort of optimization framework for different trigger threshold probabilities and how they affect hit scores and false alarm ratios. And what I mean by that is essentially what proportion of these extreme events do we actually correctly predict. That would be the hit score. And then the false alarm ratio. The false alarm ratio is the proportion of triggers that we take that are actually false alarms, in which an extreme event does not actually happen. So what we find is that by changing that trigger threshold in the forecast, we can either increase the hit score by having a lower trigger threshold, but the trade-off is that we might have some false alarms. Second project is in Ethiopia, and that's looking at rainy season timing and crop production. So there's kind of two sets of things that we're doing there. One is actually building a forecast at the onset of the rainy season. So for there, we want to actually define what onset is, determine climatological predictors that influence onset, and then create a forecast. And you can see that again on the top. The blue bars again are the forecasts, and the black dots are the observations. Again, we actually do pretty well with this. And what we can do with that is use that information to simulate forecast-informed planting and quantify that effect on maize yields. So on the bottom, you can see potentially what kind of yield gains you could get relative to a typical farmer's definition of planting or a definition of onset, and how we might improve from there. And all this wouldn't be very useful without communication, and so with that, we've developed a forecast bulletin. I'd like to thank my colleague, Sarah Alexander, who's put most of this together. And as you can see, some of our own work is on this bulletin. We're advising when would probably be the best time to plant based on our forecast. So our future work then would be to quantify the cost of inaction and the benefits of action for both of these projects so that we can do a real cost-benefit analysis. I'd like to also, for the Peru project, integrate forecasts into a full framework of lead times, not just looking at that monthly forecast, but going from the seasonal to the monthly to the weekly forecast. And then finally, in Ethiopia, I'd like to more fully quantify the effect of onset and season length on crop production, and then link that to an economic model that we're partnering with the International Food Policy Research Institute on. And with that, I'd like to thank you, and I can take questions, I guess, by email.